There is no such thing as Italy. Not really. Not in the way most people understand it. What we call Italy is actually two completely different countries sharing one flag, one government, and a deep mutual resentment that goes back centuries. There is a rich, industrial Germanic north, home to fashion houses, car manufacturers, and some of Europe's wealthiest cities. And there is a poor, agrarian Mediterranean south, struggling with unemployment, organized crime, and infrastructure that looks more like the developing world than the European Union. The income gap between these two regions is so extreme that northern Italy has a GDP per capita similar to Germany, while parts of southern Italy are closer to Greece or Portugal. The cultural differences are so profound that northerners and southerners sometimes can't understand each other's dialects. The political divisions are so deep that a major political party, Lega Nord, the Northern League, spent decades openly calling for the North to secede and form its own country called Padania. And it's all because of one river, the Po River. Italy's longest river, flowing 405 miles from the Alps to the Adriatic Sea, creating the most fertile agricultural plain in southern Europe. This river, and the geography that created it, has shaped Italian history, economy, culture, and politics for over 2,000 years. It's the reason Rome could build an empire. It's the reason medieval city-states became wealthy beyond measure. And it's the reason modern Italy is perpetually on the brink of political collapse. So here's the question: how does one river create two countries? And can a nation this divided ever actually function? Because right now, Italy isn't just split between north and south, it's splitting apart. To understand Italy's division, you have to start with the geography, because the geography is absurdly unfair. Northern Italy has the Po River Valley, a massive, flat, fertile plain stretching from Turin in the west to Venice in the east, covering about 18,000 square miles. This is the Italian breadbasket, the economic engine, the geographical lottery ticket that made the north rich. Southern Italy has mountains, lots of mountains. The Apennines run down the spine of the peninsula like a jagged backbone, creating rugged terrain that's beautiful but largely unsuitable for large-scale agriculture or easy transportation. Here's why the Po Valley is so special. The Alps to the north create a rain shadow effect, but unlike typical rain shadows that create deserts, the Po Valley gets the perfect amount of water. Rain and snow from the Alps feed countless rivers that flow into the Po, creating a natural irrigation system. The soil is deep, rich, and alluvial, deposited over millennia by flooding rivers. The climate is temperate, with warm summers and cold, but not extreme winters. It's basically perfect for agriculture. For thousands of years, the Po Valley has produced wheat, rice, corn, and wine in abundance. Compare that to southern Italy. The terrain is mountainous and fragmented. The soil is thinner and rockier. Water is scarcer. Southern Italy regularly faces droughts. The climate is hotter and less predictable. Transportation has always been difficult because you're constantly going up and down mountains rather than across flat plains. Even today, with modern engineering, building infrastructure in the south is exponentially more expensive than in the north. This geographical divide created different economic systems from the very beginning. The Po Valley supported dense populations, extensive farming, and eventually cities. Southern Italy developed a more scattered, pastoral economy based on herding, olive cultivation, and small-scale farming. These weren't just different economies, they were different ways of organizing society. The Romans understood this perfectly. When Rome was building its empire, the Po Valley, known then as Cisalpine Gaul, was considered so valuable that it was one of the first regions beyond the Italian peninsula to be fully incorporated into the Roman state. Why? Because it was the breadbasket. The Po Valley fed the empire. Meanwhile, southern Italy, including regions like Calabria and Sicily, was important for trade and strategic position, but it never had the same agricultural productivity. After the fall of Rome, the divide deepened. The Po Valley became the heartland of medieval commerce and city-states. Milan, Venice, Genoa, Florence, these cities became fabulously wealthy through trade, banking, and manufacturing. Venice controlled maritime trade routes to the east. Milan became a manufacturing powerhouse. Florence pioneered modern banking. These weren't just cities, they were independent states with their own currencies, armies, and diplomatic relations. Why did these cities thrive in the north? Geography. The Po Valley's agricultural surplus created wealth. That wealth attracted merchants. Merchants needed banking. Banking created capital for investment. The proximity to Northern Europe meant access to trade routes across the Alps. The network of rivers made internal transportation easy. It was a perfect storm of geographical advantages that created an economic explosion. Meanwhile, southern Italy followed a completely different path. After Rome fell, the south was conquered repeatedly by the Byzantine Empire, by Arab forces, by Norman knights, by Spanish kings. Each conquest brought different rulers, different systems, different ways of extracting wealth from the land. But none of them changed the fundamental geography. The south remained fragmented, rural, and relatively poor. While northern city-states were developing capitalism, the south was stuck in feudalism. Large estates owned by absentee landlords, worked by peasants with few rights, producing enough to survive, but rarely enough to create surplus wealth. Then came Italian unification in the 1860s, and this is where things get really complicated. Because Italian unification wasn't really unification. It was a conquest of the South by the North, dressed up in nationalist rhetoric. The movement was led by the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia, a northern state, and the military campaign was largely a northern enterprise. When Giuseppe Garibaldi conquered the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies in southern Italy in 1860, he handed it over to the northern king, Victor Emmanuel II. For many southerners, this wasn't liberation, it was invasion. The new Italian state immediately imposed northern laws, northern taxes, and northern administration on the south. The southern economy, which had been protected by tariffs, was suddenly exposed to competition from the more advanced northern industries. Southern textile manufacturers couldn't compete with northern factories. Southern agriculture was restructured to serve northern markets. And then came the biggest betrayal. Land reform never happened. Southern peasants had supported unification partly because they were promised land redistribution, breaking up the massive feudal estates and giving plots to the people who worked them. It never materialized. The large landowners kept their estates, often by allying with the new Italian state. The peasants got nothing. The result was catastrophe. Southern Italy plunged into violence. Brigandage, armed banditry, swept the countryside as displaced peasants turned to rebellion. The Italian army responded with brutal repression. Tens of thousands of Southerners were killed. Entire villages were destroyed. Historians now describe this as a civil war, though it's rarely taught that way in Italian schools. The economic divergence accelerated. Northern Italy industrialized rapidly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Factories sprang up in Milan, Turin, and Genoa. The Po Valley became the industrial heartland of Italy. Meanwhile, southern Italy remained agricultural, underdeveloped, and increasingly impoverished. The only solution for many Southerners was immigration. Between 1876 and 1976, approximately 26 million Italians emigrated, the majority from the south. They went to the Americas, to Northern Europe, and increasingly to Northern Italy itself. This internal migration created new tensions. Southern Italians moving to northern cities for work were often treated as foreigners in their own country. They faced discrimination in housing and employment. Northern Italians developed stereotypes of Southerners as lazy, criminal, and backward. Southern Italians developed stereotypes of Northerners as cold, greedy, and arrogant. These weren't just prejudices, they were formalized in social science. In the early 20th century, Italian criminologists like Cesare Lombroso actually argued that Southern Italians were biologically inferior, using pseudoscientific racial theories that sound horrifying today. Fast forward to today, and the North-South divide isn't a historical curiosity. It's the defining feature of Italian politics and economics. Let's start with the numbers, because they're staggering. The unemployment rate in northern Italy is around 5 or 6%, similar to Germany. In southern Italy, it's over 15%, and youth unemployment exceeds 40% in some regions. That's not a recession, that's structural economic failure. GDP per capita tells the same story. Lombardy, the northern region that includes Milan, has a GDP per capita of about $42,000. Calabria, at the toe of Italy's boot, has a GDP per capita of about $18,000. That's less than half. Imagine if the gap between California and Mississippi was that large. That's what Italy is dealing with. Infrastructure reflects this divide too. Northern Italy has high-speed trains, modern highways, efficient ports, and world-class airports. Southern Italy has crumbling roads, limited rail service, and ports that can't handle modern container ships. The Italian government has tried to address this through investment programs, but the results have been mixed at best. Corruption, organized crime, and bureaucratic inefficiency mean that EU funds designated for southern development often disappear into black holes of waste and graft. And speaking of organized crime, this is where the divide gets even darker. The mafia, in its various forms, including the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, the Calabrian 'Ndrangheta, and the Neapolitan Camorra, is overwhelmingly a southern phenomenon. These aren't just criminal organizations, they're parallel power structures that have existed for over a century. They control construction, waste disposal, agriculture, and increasingly, legitimate businesses. The 'Ndrangheta alone is estimated to have annual revenues of $53 billion, making it one of the largest economic actors in Italy. Why is organized crime so prevalent in the south? Part of it is historical. The mafia emerged partly because the Italian state was weak and couldn't provide security or justice. Part of it is economic. Poverty and unemployment create fertile ground for criminal recruitment. And part of it is political. Organized crime has deep connections with local politicians, creating a system of corruption that's incredibly difficult to dismantle. Northern Italians look at these statistics and increasingly ask, why are we subsidizing the South? Because that's what's happening. The Italian state collects more taxes from the wealthy North and redistributes to the poorer South through government spending, infrastructure projects, and social programs. Northern regions are net contributors to the national budget. Southern regions are net recipients. This is where Lega Nord comes in. Founded in the late 1980s, the Northern League explicitly campaigned on Northern identity and Northern grievances. Their slogan was Padania for the Padanians, referring to their proposed independent nation named after the Po Valley, or Padanian Plain. They claimed that Northerners were subsidizing Southern laziness and corruption. They demanded federalism, greater regional autonomy, and an end to wealth redistribution. At their peak in the 1990s and early 2000s, Lega Nord was winning over 10% of the national vote. They held symbolic referendums on independence. They created a Padanian flag, anthem, and even mock government institutions. It was treated as a joke by many, but it reflected real anger and frustration in the north. The party has since rebranded as simply Lega, the League, and shifted focus from regional separatism to Italian nationalism and anti-immigration politics. But the underlying resentment hasn't disappeared. It's just found new targets. Now the narrative isn't just the South is draining our resources, but also immigrants are taking our jobs and threatening our culture. Meanwhile, the South has its own grievances. Southerners point out that unification was never fair, that the North industrialized by exploiting Southern resources and labor, and that ongoing underdevelopment is the result of deliberate policy choices. They argue that organized crime thrives because the Italian state abandoned the South. They point to the billions in EU funds that were supposed to develop the South but were mismanaged by corrupt politicians, many of whom had Northern connections. And they're not entirely wrong. The historical exploitation is real. The lack of investment is real. The institutional failure is real. But the question is, does historical injustice justify current dysfunction? And can a modern democracy function when half the country feels exploited and the other half feels abandoned? The European dimension. Italy's North-South divide has implications far beyond Italy itself. The European Union is watching this very carefully because Italy is the third largest economy in the EU and a founding member. If Italy fractures, it would send shockwaves through the entire European project. EU structural funds have poured billions into southern Italy to reduce regional disparities. The results have been disappointing. Some projects succeeded, but many failed due to corruption, mismanagement, or simply being poorly designed. The EU is now more cautious about funding Italy and demands stricter oversight. Italy's political instability, the country has had over 60 governments since World War II, is partly rooted in this North-South divide. Coalitions are fragile because regional interests often override party loyalty. Southern politicians need to deliver jobs and investment to their constituents. Northern politicians need to show they're not wasting taxpayer money. These goals are often incompatible, leading to government gridlock and collapse. The migration crisis has added another layer of complexity. Most migrants arriving by sea land in southern Italy, Sicily, Calabria, Puglia. These regions are already struggling with unemployment and poverty, and now they're expected to absorb and integrate thousands of migrants with limited resources. Northern regions resist taking in migrants, arguing they're already subsidizing the south. Southern regions argue they're being left to deal with a national and European problem on their own. This creates a vicious cycle. The south struggles economically, receives migrants, lacks resources to integrate them, sees social tensions rise, and becomes even less attractive for investment. Meanwhile, the north prospers, resists helping the south, grows more resentful of redistribution. The Po River Valley created northern Italy's wealth. The mountains and fragmented terrain of the south limited its development. This geographical divide became an economic divide, which became a cultural divide, which became a political divide. And now, 160 years after unification, Italy remains two countries wearing one flag. Can it be fixed? Maybe. Investment in southern infrastructure, education, and industry could narrow the gap over time. Serious efforts to combat organized crime and corruption could create conditions for growth. Political reforms could give regions more autonomy while maintaining national unity. But all of this requires political will, sustained effort, and a shared sense of national identity. And right now, Italy has none of those things. The irony is that Italy has everything it needs to be a successful, unified nation. It has a rich cultural heritage, a talented population, but it can't overcome a geographic divide that was established by rivers and mountains millions of years ago and reinforced by 2,000 years of history. There is no such thing as Italy. There's the Po River Valley, wealthy and industrial, looking north toward Europe. And there's the Mezzogiorno, the south, struggling and agricultural, looking across the Mediterranean. They share a peninsula, a language, and a government, but they don't share a future. And until they do, Italy will remain what it's always been, a beautiful, dysfunctional fiction held together by little more than inertia and a river running through the north. If you want to understand more about how geography shapes national identity and political stability, check out our video on why Belgium is really two countries. And let me know in the comments, can Italy overcome its north-south divide, or is the split inevitable? Thanks for watching.